Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Troy. Hey, listen, here we go again. The Supreme Court is back in session again. They just wrapped up their session in June. They take a summer break, and then they hear oral arguments again in October and November. So we're into their new year. We're into their new term, and we've got some doozies of cases coming for the Supreme Court. We got stuff on gerrymandering, the environment, climate change. We've got a potential case coming before the Supreme Court that could be the death knell of our entire democracy. I'll come to that in a minute. But this could not be a worse time in our history to have the current makeup of the Supreme Court that we have. It's 6-3 conservative, but it's 6-3 stacked with Federalist Society cult members who are just there to undermine our democracy, undermine our democratic institutions. They've been trained for this for years. The Federalist Society has been training judges. They handpick judges who they know have conservative leanings, and they train them from the time that they're very young judges. They train them and they groom them to enact laws, to take a much more conservative stance, to take a conservative activist stance, really, to undo 14th Amendment protections, to undo precedents in our law that protects equal opportunity, equal rights in this country. And they try to get these people to the Supreme Court, and to not just the Supreme Court, but to higher federal courts and district courts, high positions of power in our country, unelected people in extremely high positions of power that hold very, very extremist right-wing fascist views that are groomed by the Federalist Society. And remember, we have three justices on this court that were installed by traitor Donald Trump, one of which was stolen from the Obama administration, given to Trump. Trump was able, even though he's a traitor and a terrorist and a threat to our nation, he was able to install three people on the Supreme Court who have lifetime appointments. So now the court makeup is 6-3 with six of these Federalist Society conservative judges and three just, they call them liberal judges, but they're just sort of normal judges at this point. Anybody who isn't a fascist could be considered a liberal at this point, I suppose. But take a look at some of these cases that are coming before the Supreme Court. They heard a case this week on gerrymandering, on a law in Alabama regarding gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the process where legislators in a state draw the district boundaries for congressional representation to favor one party over the other. Republicans have been guilty of this now for decades. You look at some of the boundary lines of some of these congressional maps, these congressional district maps, and they just look ridiculous. You got pieces of a district here that snake over here and attached to this little area. And the reason is they're trying to cut as many people that may vote Democrat, read minorities, people of color, out of these districts to minimize their power so that the districts will always vote Republican. One of these laws was challenged in Alabama, and it made it to the Supreme Court, and it basically said that there is no constitutional way under the 14th Amendment that Alabama, which has a huge black population, should only have one majority black congressional district, that violates the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. That made it to the Supreme Court. But remember, it's this makeup of the Supreme Court. So they heard oral arguments on that yesterday and today. And the indications are already coming down that the conservative majority on this court is going to take an activist position on the Voting Rights Act and make it even harder for people in Alabama to sue. They're going to raise the legal bar for people in Alabama to sue over gerrymandering, making it easier for the Republicans in Alabama to continue gerrymandering. But as with the case with all Supreme Court decisions, it doesn't just affect this one case. Supreme Court decisions carry precedent. They can affect as much as the Supreme Court wants it to affect. If they announce that this law, if their interpretation of this law has broad sweeping effects on the 14th Amendment, broad sweeping effects on the Voting Rights Act, that will affect all of us. A lot of political pundits are already talking about the fact that this may be the death knell of the Voting Rights Act, which is ostensibly a permanent provision, permanent constitutional provision in our society. But since the 80s, conservative justices like this have just been gutting it. That's been sort of priority number one, was for them to gut this Voting Rights Act, which is supposed to guarantee equal access to the voting booth regardless of race. And that's really what this Alabama what this Alabama case is all about. The plaintiffs are suing because they're saying that the gerrymandering in Alabama is discriminatory against people of color, against black people of color in the state. And Republicans are using sort of a reverse racism argument on this. They're saying that they can't. It's actually the reverse. They're arguing that they can't ensure more black representation because that in itself would be racist, which doesn't make any freaking sense. Ketanji Brown Jackson called them out on that. She had a great response. She said, it was drafted to give a constitutional foundation for a piece of legislation that was designed to make people who had less opportunity and less rights equal to white citizens. So with that as the framing in the background, I'm trying to understand your position to that Section 2, which is what they're arguing over, which by its plain text is doing the same thing, is saying you need to identify people in this community who have less opportunity and less ability to participate and ensure that that's remedied. And so Ketanji Brown Jackson in her first case on the Supreme Court, just killing it, just proving why she was an amazing choice, really asking tough questions to the to the Alabama Republicans who are trying to gut the Voting Rights Act, really just showing out. But what's predictably happening now is we can tell by the questions that the conservatives on the court are asking which way they're leaning. We did this with Roe. We kind of knew that Roe was doomed because of the questions that the conservatives on the court were asking. They were asking a lot of leading questions that made it pretty easy to determine where they stood on the case, and made it pretty easy to determine that they were leaning towards striking down Roe versus Wade. So on this one, we're getting questions from the conservatives on the court, particularly from Alito. Once again, Alito is just proving to be one of the most insanely right-wing fascist members of this court. We're getting we're kind of understanding what they intend to do, and it may just be the final death knell of the Voting Rights Act. So just a crazy, crazy time. The Supreme Court is extremely politicized. It's full of these 6 conservative judges on this court, with the exception of maybe John Roberts, who has shown his ability to stand up against the other 5 conservatives. But certainly the other 5 conservatives on this court are partisan hacks. They're Federalist Society stooges, and they're essentially fascists. They're right-wing fascists who have now the ability to absolutely gut and undermine our democracy. And it's about to get really serious over here this term. This may even be a more damaging term for our country than the last Supreme Court term was. That's because they're also about to hear a case this term called Moore versus Harper, which comes out of North Carolina, which is basically, the long and short of it is, it would allow a strict literalist constitutionalist interpretation of how federal elections are managed in state, which is the Constitution says that state legislatures are primarily responsible for running federal elections within states. Now, we do that. Legislatures are the main arbiters of elections in states, but we do apply checks and balances like any other aspect of our society. We apply checks and balances. So if the legislature is acting out of hand, the governor or a judge or the state Supreme Court can step in and say that the legislature has overstepped its hand and reverse some of the decisions that the legislature has made. We saw that a lot in the election of 2020 when some of these crazy Republican red state fascist state legislatures were trying to throw out the votes. We're trying to send in alternate slates of electors. We're really just trying to mess with the democratic process in order to keep Donald Trump in power. They were thankfully checked, stopping votes, just all this corrupt shit that they were trying to do. That was checked by governors of goodwill of both parties. That was checked by state Supreme Courts, by judges. That's balance of power. That's checks and balances. That's what we need to ensure free and fair elections. This Moore v. Harper decision, if it goes the way we think it's going to go with the conservative fascists on this court, they could undo that and take a literalist approach to the Constitution, saying that state legislatures have all power to govern federal elections in the state, removing that system of checks and balances. So now in the next election, 2024, if that were to happen, you could have a repeat of 2020, but without the checks and balances. You could have legislatures sending alternate slate of electors, determining that the popular vote doesn't matter, throwing votes out, throwing cases out, shutting down voting when one candidate is ahead. Just a real shit show if you give unchecked power to some of these insane right-wing fascist state legislatures. So that Moore v. Harper case, we got to keep an eye on that. That's going to be a hugely consequential case for the future of our democracy. Now, we're not going to know the outcomes of these cases until June. Again, the Supreme Court calendar, they hear oral arguments in the fall, in October, November. They debate throughout the spring and make their decisions, and then their decisions are announced in June, which is why we just heard June, in the beginning of the summer, we just got the information about the Roe v. Wade decision, what their vote was on that. So now we're hearing new arguments for new cases, and we're going to find out in June really some very, very consequential decisions for the future of our democracy. But once again, the conservatives on the court asking leading questions, they would bring us to believe that they are planning on now, at least for this one case, planning on seriously gutting the Voting Rights Act, which has already been severely gutted by conservative courts over the past few decades, which could just spell doom for equal rights and equal protection in our country. It's just a very, very scary time for our democracy with these unelected right-wing fascists having so much power, a politicized court, a court of political hacks, and people see it too, which is why the Supreme Court has its lowest approval rating in decades. Nobody trusts the Supreme Court anymore. They've lost all their integrity, and it's really incumbent upon Biden and the Democrats to do something about this, up to and including adding more members to the court. But to do that, we need more majorities in Congress, which means we got to get out and vote. It always comes back to voting. Everything we want to do in this country, we need people to show up and vote. Otherwise, we can just kiss our democracy goodbye, because we don't have the power to stop this without bigger majorities in Congress. So we got to get out there and vote. It's a very scary time. For MeidasTouch, this is Troy. Thank you for watching. Remember, please smash that subscribe button to keep supporting independent media.
MeidasTouch is unapologetically pro-democracy. And look, we know you are too. So please make sure you check out our best-selling shirt and our best-selling gear, the unapologetically pro-democracy gear. And hey, while you're at it, make sure you check out my favorite shirt and one of our most famous designs. It wasn't rigged, you're just a loser. At store.meidastouch.com. That's store.meidastouch.com.